Hi, long range hunting. Today we're going to be covering match bullets in relation to terminal ballistics and using them for hunting, especially at long range. Now, this is something that I see in a lot of groups, and it's very misunderstood. And part of that comes from marketing, and part of it comes from people that don't like long range hunting and really don't have an understanding of bullet construction and terminal ballistics. And what is terminal ballistics? Terminal ballistics is what happens inside that animal. So when that bullet enters that animal and it goes in there, it causes damage, it has a temporary wound cavity, the either hydraulic shock or hydrostatic shock, and then you have your permanent wound cavity, which we'll cover in a second. But what happens in the animal, what it does, is what's called terminal ballistics. And so we're going to talk about terminal ballistics and external ballistics a little bit here today. But I've got some diagrams, Again, with the move, I don't know where my whiteboard is, or else I'd be doing this on a whiteboard. So instead, I'm overcoming and adapting, and we're going to use a nice moving box for our display. But today, and I'm going to talk a lot about my favorite match bullet for hunting, which is the ELD match. There's a lot of misconceptions, and several I want to point out right now and just address is that match bullets aren't for hunting, and they're not going to expand, and they're only for punching paper or steel. And this is very far from the truth. And the reason that they aren't marketed as a hunting bullet has to do with politicians. Some politicians years ago got together, and again, it's like military intelligence. It's an oxymoron. Politicians are idiots. A bunch of them that had never seen combat decided that they wanted to ban the use of hunting bullets or expanding bullets being unethical for combat. So think about that. You can blow somebody up. You can light them on fire with a flamethrower. You can blow holes with them in a machine gun. You can drop a bomb on them and send them in every place imaginable within a 200-yard radius. You can do all this stuff, but using a bullet that expands, that makes it more lethal and performs the way it is unethical and inhumane. It's ridiculous. Now, snipers need to be able to kill. And how do they sidestep that with bullets? It's simple marketing. Now, this is not something that a lot of people admit. Again, there could be legal liabilities. It's something I know from experience and from dealing with certain people. But match bullets do expand. And if you look at the similarities between, let's take the ELD match and let's take a Berger VLD for a perfect example. Go research the Berger VLD. You have a target and you have a hunting. Now, what's the difference between them? The only difference is the jacket. And all the difference is the thickness of the jacket. And so what they advertise is you practice with a target and then go to the hunting. And the reason is because of how much thinner that jacket is on the VLD bullet for hunting. And so essentially they're the exact same thing. And so you can interchange and practice with one and then shoot the other. Well, here's the whole thing. That is a microscopic difference. And the reason they say that is that thinner jacket, as it heats up, can disform as it's going through the firing process if you're really getting that gun worked up. And so you can use both, but they're the same bullet. They have the same core. They're made out of the same jacket. And again, it's just a little bit of thickness difference in thickness. Now, the ELD match and the ELDX, one is labeled for hunting, one is not. Now, if you actually go to Hornady and look up the description of both, guess what? They both have the same tip, the same jacket, and the same core. The only difference is how the ELDX is shaped, and that's to aid in expansion. It has a lock ring inside of it, and the actual jacket thickness as it goes through the bullet. So there's some slight changes, but they're essentially the exact same thing. They're the same construction. Now, in testing, and both external ballistics of how it flies, going out to a mile. I've done extensive testing, and so have a lot of other guys in the group. The ELD match is much more aerodynamic, and so it really handles that transonic and subsonic flight better. So external ballistic-wise, how it flies, it outperformed the X hands down. Now, let's talk terminal ballistics. Now, one is shaped a little bit different, and the match has a little bit thinner jacket. However, in testing, both are almost identical in terminal ballistics. And what I mean by that is I could shoot 2 deer in the exact same spot with the same bullet, and I could show you both wound cavities, and I doubt anybody could tell me the difference between the two. And that's why the match has really excelled as far as a good hunting bullet, is because the fact that it gives you the same terminal ballistics as the X with better flight. So you have, it's more aerodynamic. And again, bullets can destabilize during transonic and subsonic flight. And I've never had an issue with that with the ELD match bullets. And again, I've tested them extensively in multiple guns out to a mile, 1,760 yards. So I've also killed out to 724 yards and had phenomenal results. Now, I've hunted with a bunch of different match bullets. I used Sierra Match Kings for quite a while. I've also used the AMAX, which is the bullet that was around before this, and it's still around, but all of them have had great results. But the ELD Match has just done a phenomenal job, especially with the higher BC as far as flying versus the older AMAX. Now, between my son and I, he's gotten 5, but we've had a total of 62 animals that we've taken with the ELD match from 10 feet to 724 yards, from everything from a coyote clear up to a bison. Now, I dropped that bison dead in its tracks at 100 yards with an ELD match bullet. The guide who had been guiding for years for bison told me that he has never seen a bison drop like that. And again, sometimes, they'll stutter a little, but it went straight down. And opening that up, again, this guy's been doing this for 20 years. And his first comment when he opened it up was he was amazed by the amount of damage. He's never seen a hunting bullet cause that much terminal damage on that animal, and it dies very quickly. And we're going to delve into the terminal ballistic side of it. But again, these work for hunting. Due to military contracts, they have to market it differently. They can't market it as it, or they can't sell it to the military. But these still work very well. And a little something in the long range community is the bullet is the truth. Theories don't mean anything. If you can't prove it in the field, it's nothing more than a theory. And everything I base off, and all the guys in the group base off, is real life and going by what the bullet is. If you build everything around what the bullet does, you'll never be wrong. And so if you as far as members in the group, if you go to the topics section and look, we actually have a terminal ballistics and bullet construction section. And it's a bunch of members that have contributed at different distances and different match bullets and hunting bullets. And it's going to show pictures of those different animals, the insides. And again, we study this. The average person really doesn't. The average person, either going to let their guide handle it. They do it, they're going to get the guts out real quick, and they're going to take it to the butcher. Not a lot of guys butcher their own meat or study it. I butcher my own stuff, and so it's one of those things, and I also do my own taxidermy, so I get to see a lot and be able to study, and I document that. And so do a lot of these other guys. We're taking everything out, but we're also taking pictures as we go, and throughout the year we're going to study, and we're going to use that to better hunt. And again, it's our goal as hunters to have a quick, clean, ethical kill. And I want to bring up another misconception just because of that. Damage is bad. You're wasting meat. Nothing is further from the truth. Damage kills. I see a lot of guys, and I argue with them quite a bit on this, and they'll tell me I'm unethical because I cause too much damage. Yet they go for a bullet that causes the minimal amount of damage. And the consistency, again, in the field is they always have long track jobs, and most of them end up losing animals every single year. They'll find little to no blood. Now, on my end, I'm using these match bullets, and I know what I'm doing, and 95% of the animals die dead on the spot. They will drop instantly on the spot. And yes, I'm causing a lot of damage, but again, that massive damage, both as far as the hole and inside that animal, it's shutting down its system. It's so much trauma that it's dropping that animal dead in its tracks, and it's bleeding out fast. And even if it does, I've had only a handful of animals ever run with a match bullet, and even when they did, it's that death run. And what I mean by that is it's running out of pure adrenaline, and the most ones ever made it was 30 yards. And that one left a red carpet on both sides. I mean, trees were covered in blood, and it was just a matter of seconds. It ran 30 yards in a bolt and then keeled over. And so even when they do, and again, it's only been a handful of animals that have actually ran with it, but that damage is ensuring a quick, lethal kill. And it's up to the individual on how much damage they want to cause or what they find acceptable. But a common thing that I hear is, oh, you wasted a quarter of the animal by shooting it right there, and it's got, a 3-inch hole or whatever it is if you're at close range. Now, this is further from the truth, and it goes to animal anatomy. If you are shooting right behind the shoulder here on the rib cage, and you actually go and take that meat off and then weigh it and see what the actual damage is, it's drastically incorrect. On a white-tailed deer, the most I've ever had loss-wise is about a half a pound. Again, even if you take the bruised section, let's say you take a 6-inch section, that meat doesn't weigh a whole lot. You've got a very thin part. People are thinking about ribs and everything, and that's not a factor because, again, you're not eating the ribs. We're talking about pure meat. If you do a shoulder shot at longer range, these front shoulders don't have a lot of meat. A lot of, especially the upper part for a high shoulder, is bone. And then there's some rib meat under there. And so you lose a hair more meat there, but really not much. And also it can depend on if it exits the other side or if it stops inside the animal, depending on what you hit and distance. Now, you're not losing that much. On an elk, most behind the shoulder shots, you're losing less than a pound. So again, it's not as drastic as people think. They don't have a real understanding. It's kind of like, I know a lot of butchers that they get guys that say, oh, I had a 200-pound deer, where's my 200 pounds of meat? Well, that's not realistic. Depending on animal, you're going to get anywhere from 30 to 40% meat back, depending on how they utilize it and the animal anatomy. Like a bison has a lot of bone, so you don't actually get as much meat as you would think versus a deer or an elk. So you got to really understand these things and look at it. And again, I know this because I've weighed it. I have physically taken sections, and even sections that were not damaged, to make sure I'm getting the full weight. And when I trim it off, I set it on a scale and weigh it to make a better education on what I'm doing, a better understanding. And so what I want to know is, how much am I going to lose and how effective is it? And again, people get wound up on losing too much meat. I'm a meat hunter, this and that. You're not losing a lot. You're really not. It's almost ridiculous to say that. And there are some times where you can hit it, and especially if you're not using that bullet right in your shot placement, where you can get a lot more damage. And again, it's a balance of what you want to do. But again, we as hunters, our responsibility is to get a quick, clean kill. And damage does that, especially inside of the chest cavity, which is our goal. Now, on that note, I want to cover something. I've seen a lot of this recently, talking to different guys who said, oh, I experimented with this, and particularly in burger bullets. Now, a burger bullet is designed as a very thin jacket, and it's a fragmentation. And what that does is you're going to shoot, and it's going to enter that animal, especially at long range, and it's going to instantly and violently open up, and it's going to fragment into pieces, and it's going to open up that temporary wound cavity with almost a grenade of shrapnel going in that chest cavity, causing massive trauma and putting that animal down very quickly. It's an effective design. Now, some people dislike them, some like to use them. It's, again, personal choice, but using it in the wrong way can have a major effect. And what I mean by that is, I've known a couple guys that they'll try shoulder shots. Now, when you're shooting a shoulder shot at range, down range, at a long ways, that's a very good shot placement. And I can show you why in a second. But at close range, when you're talking very high velocity, that's not really ideal. And the reason I say that is because of what that bullet's designed. Now, they'll blame the bullet. They'll say, oh, well, it didn't work. Well, no, it worked exactly how it is. They didn't have an actual understanding of what it was doing. And so they utilized it wrong. Now, at close range, you're going to want behind the ribs because of that. You don't want to do a shoulder shot, especially at over 2,200 feet per second. And what these guys will do is they'll try a close range, high velocity shot, and that bullet is rapidly expanding and it's hitting that bone. And so what's happening is you're starting that temporary wound cavity early. And this is something I've also heard with the ELD match. And again, the ELD match is not a fragmentation bullet, but people will say it blows up. And what they'll do is they'll shoot it and they're going to see a hole on the entrance and they say, oh, well, the bullet blew up. No, it didn't. I've shot 30 animals inside of what I consider close range up to 10 feet. And every time I've had that, there's been two common factors. I've either found the bullet inside the animal, it has stopped, or I found the exit hole from the bullet. And I'm not talking about multiple holes, I'm talking about one single good exit hole in that animal. And so it works effectively if you use it right. But what they'll do is they'll shoot it wrong. It starts that temporary wound cavity. And what I mean by that is you have over 2,200 feet per second, you have what's called hydraulic shock. Now, everybody knows hydrostatic shock. And that was what happens under 2,200 feet per second. And it's basically almost the same thing. It's that temporary wound cavity. If you ever watch ballistics gel, when you watch it, you're going to see that bullet enter, and then you're going to see this wave of massive expansion, and once it stops, there's going to be the bullet in there, and there's going to be a permanent wound cavity. And so what you're doing is pistols will have hydrostatic shock, which is what happens underneath. And a good way to explain that is because you're shooting a water-based mammal, it has an elasticity point. And so when that bullet goes in and dumps that energy, it's creating this temporary wound cavity. And if you take a rubber band and you stretch it in every direction to the point where the fibers itself were starting to come across and break, but it was still intact, that's like hydrostatic shock. It's stretching through there, it's causing stuff to rupture, bleed. Now, over 2,200 feet per second, this is why rifles are more lethal than pistols, is hydraulic shock. And it's an exaggerated version of that to the point where you are stretching that elasticity point to the breaking point. So it's beyond what the elasticity of that animal can handle, and so it's rupturing. And a good way to describe this is if anybody, hunter, has shot a close range animal and you go to recover it and the entire chest cavity is nothing but soup with chunks, everything's in pieces, that's hydraulic shock versus hydrostatic shock. And so what happens is people see that big hole and they say, oh, the bullet blew up. Well, that's not necessarily true. And I'm going to show you on my fancy diagram here what I'm talking about. All right, now this is crude. Again, I don't have my normal stuff, but right here is a perfect example. So here's a normal animal, and what you're going to want to do is here's the hide and skin and everything, and this bullet is going to enter. And after it enters, it's going to start to expand, and then it's going to open up this temporary wound cavity that's going to cause all those issues. And you have your permanent wound cavity here, whether it stops over here or whether it continues out. And two holes are always better than one. The faster it can bleed out, the faster it's going to die. Now, this bottom one right here, however, is what's happening when you hit that at a high velocity with a low impact expanding round. And what's going to happen here is instead of it going in a little bit and then opening up, you're causing that massive expansion. And what you're doing is you're causing that temporary wound cavity, that hydraulic shock, to open up early, right at under the skin level where the rib cage is. And so what that is it's when that bullet hits and it causes that wound cavity, you're starting it earlier. And so that temporary wound cavity is ripping it beyond the elasticity point. And that's what puts that big hole, entrance hole into the animal. It's not the bullet blowing up. It's that temporary wound cavity. And so what's happening is you're starting it here and you're dumping it into here versus where it's at the center. Now, depending on the bullet and the size of the animal, it could travel through and cause the entire thing to do it. But again, it's still a very lethal shot. And that's what I don't get a lot of people complain about that, but at the same time, it's very effective. And the reason being, imagine you as a human, if I blew a 3-inch hole into your chest and then that temporary wound cavity vaporized everything into chunks, your heart and everything, you're going to bleed out very fast, and there's a very, very slim possibility that you would ever recover from that. And so it's not a bad thing. Again, it goes to damage, and again, taxidermy can make it a little bit difficult, but again, this is still a very lethal shot. So, and you need to put that to bed of, unless it's a fragmentation bullet, most likely it's not blowing up, as they say. It's simply that temporary wound cavity that's causing that damage, and people look at it without knowing what they're looking at, and that's their first assumption, which, again, that's an assumption that makes sense to someone who doesn't understand it, and I can even see where it makes sense, but it's not the actual bullet, it's that temporary wound cavity. And so Another thing I want to touch real quick is bullet selection for required terminal ballistics on different animals. And a common thing I hear that is incredibly wrong, and I'm going to zoom in here real quick and show you. Now, one of the most common things I hear with this is animal weight. And let me be very clear. Animal weight has nothing to do with it. The weight, you're not shooting an 800-pound animal. You're shooting a section of an 800-pound animal. And the weight is irrelevant, because I hear that all the time. Well, that might work on a 200-pound deer, but it's not going to work on an 800-pound elk. Yeah, it can, if you know what you're doing. Now, let's take this diagram and this diagram, and we're going to compare a moose. So let's say we have a Yukon moose and it's 1,500 pounds, and let's take an African Cape water buffalo that weighs the exact same 1,500 pounds. Now, you can notice these are drawn differently, and the reason is what you want to calculate for isn't weight, because again, these animals weigh the same, but their body construction, their anatomy is very, very different. And so that anatomy, the moose is thinner, it's not as thick, it has a thinner skin and thinner layer of muscle, and so you're going to get very similar results to a deer. It's just a larger scale. But again, you don't need a really hard jacketed bullet. So this ELD match would go in on a moose. It would go in, it would open up that bullet, it would cause that temporary wound cavity and exit or not exit. And then you take this. Now, if I use the same ELD match bullet on that Cape buffalo, which has a very, very tough hide, and it has very, very dense and thick, it's a very wide animal, this bullet is going to do this. And it's possible that it could open up that wound cavity and not get to the vitals before stopping, because of the amount of penetration. And so with the Cape buffalo, you want a very hard bullet that is going to penetrate a certain amount and then start to expand and dump that energy inside that animal. And so if you use this ELD match for this shot, you're going to get piss poor performance. If you use the ELD match for this moose, it's going to give you good performance. Now, if you take that thick, hard-jacketed bullet here and you shoot a moose, it's just going to blow right through. You're going to get that pencil through. And I've seen that a lot. I've seen guys take elephant guns and water buffalo guns, like the 375 H&H Magnum, and shoot deer, and the deer runs off. And they go, I don't understand, it just penciled through. Well, yeah, because it's not meeting the resistance necessary, and even if it's starting to, it's already out of that body by the time it is. So the bullet for here that is ideal for this terminal ballistics isn't going to do anything for you here unless you hit a bone and force that expansion. So it's one of those things that even though these weigh the same, you're going to need two different bullet choices. And even think about it in terms of archery. If you get a moose and a Cape buffalo, even watch the hunts, look at Michael Waddell, look at some of the other guys and who have done archery on both, you'll see them shoot a moose, get passed through, the moose goes down, easy. They take that same arrow and they could shoot a Cape buffalo 20 times. There's a hunter, a professional hunter and trapper that I like, and he actually weights his arrows down with sand to give him that extra penetration. And so when it hits, that sand hits forward and pushes that arrow deeper to get the penetration required. And so forget about weight. Weight is irrelevant. What you want to focus on is the bullet construction and how that's going to act. And also you want to focus on the animal's anatomy itself. What are you hitting? What is your shot placement? What is it having to go through? Again, that has to do with how the bullet's going to react. And you need to look at density and depth of penetration required. And you need to weigh all that in to pick the correct bullet for the correct terminal ballistics. And again, you can use the same bullet on here, but if I take a shoulder shot at a certain distance, it could not perform well. However, I shoot it behind the shoulder and it can perform perfectly. And so it's one of those things that you need to pick the bullet for what you're going to do in the distances. And again, you can round it out and use it for different distances. You're just simply going to have to change your shot placement in order to maximize those terminal ballistics. And so we have this diagram here. Again, it's not the best, but what I'm talking about a high shoulder right here is putting it right here. And you can see there's the lungs here, you have the heart here, you have your spine here. And what this does, the high shoulder shot, is when you hit it at long range, it's going to snap both shoulders. It's also going to separate the shoulders. It's going to snap the spine, and it's going to send bone fragments and that bullet flying through like a grenade. And so You have that temporary wound cavity in here, which is going to cause rupturing and bleeding from the heart and lungs. And you also have that grenade of bullet pieces going through and bone fragments, and it's going to cause all these to rupture. It causes massive trauma, and it drops the animal on the spot. And if you watch long-range hunting videos and you see them shoot it in the shoulder and it drops instantly just like it's anchored there, this is the shot they're using. It's very, very effective, and it's actually used by professional hunters.